Welcome everybody to DGMA Doctrine Productions. Here we believe doctrine matters because truth shapes faith and faith shapes eternity. And the mission is simple: preach the word, teach the truth, and proclaim Christ. And we're going to begin a series where we begin to examine one of the most widely taught end times doctrines in modern evangelical Christianity, the doctrine of the rapture. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Millions of Christians believe that Jesus will secretly remove believers from the earth before a future 7-year tribulation. And that's a key concept to understanding this doctrine, is that future 7-year tribulation. Without the future 7-year tribulation, the doctrine pretty much falls apart. Books have been written about it, movies have been portrayed, and entire prophecy ministries have been built around this idea. An important historical question must be asked: did the early church actually teach this doctrine? Or is this rapture a much later development in Christian theology? And today we'll begin to examine the historical origins of the doctrine. So first, we should clarify an important point. The word rapture does not appear in the English Bible. It comes from the Latin word rapturo, used in the Latin Vulgate translation of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17. And the verse reads, "Then we who are alive, who remain, shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air." The Greek word translated caught up is harpazo, meaning to seize or to snatch away. And don't make fun of my Greek. I'm not good at pronouncing it. That's not the point, okay? Now, the Latin translators rendered this word from the English theological term rapture, which eventually appeared. The Latin translators rendered this word repumor, from which the English theological term rapture eventually developed. But the real issue is not the word itself. The real question is, does Scripture teach a secret removal of the church before the tribulation? And to answer that question, we have to examine church history. So when we examine the writings of the early church fathers, the theologians closest to the time of the apostles, we find something very revealing. They consistently describe one visible return of Christ, not two separate comings. So let me show you a few examples. First, Justin Martyr in the 2nd century. Justin Martyr wrote around AD 160, and in his work, Dialogue with Typho, he describes believers experiencing tribulation before Christ's return. Now, Justin Martyr writes, "But I and others who are right-minded Christians on all points are assured that there will be a resurrection of the dead, and afterward an eternal judgment." That's from the Dialogue with Typho, chapter 80. Now, Justin connects resurrection, judgment, and Christ's return as a single climactic event. There is no mention of a secret rapture removing believers from the earth before a tribulation. Irenaeus in the late 2nd century, which is another important witness, Irenaeus, writing around AD 180 in his book Against the Heresies, book 5, Irenaeus discusses the rise of the Antichrist and the persecution of believers before Christ's return. He writes, when this Antichrist shall have devastated all things in this world, he will reign for 3 years and 6 months. And then the Lord will come from heavens in the clouds. And this is from Against the Heresies, book 5, chapter 30. But note the sequence. He says, tribulation occurs, Antichrist persecutes believers, and then Christ returns. So again, there is no secret removal of the church beforehand. Let's get into Tertullian, 3rd century. Another early Christian theologian, writing around AD 200, he also describes the church enduring persecution before Christ returns. Enduring persecution, not escaping it, not being magically taken away in some secret resurrection or rapture, but enduring it. On the resurrection of the flesh, he states, "The saints shall rise at the coming of the Lord." So he connects resurrection directly with Christ's visible return. Let's get into another theologian of the 3rd century, Hippolytus. Now, Hippolytus wrote a treatise titled On Christ and Antichrist, and he describes believers suffering under the Antichrist before the return of Christ. Notice that, suffering under the Antichrist before the return of Christ. So Hippolytus writes, "The church shall pass through persecution until the Lord appears from heaven." Again, tribulation first, then Christ returns. How about Augustine, 4th to 5th century? Moving forward centuries, right? The great theologian Augustine of Hippo, he also describes a single return of Christ. In his book, The City of God, Book 20, Augustine writes that Christ will return once to judge the living and the dead. Augustine does not teach a secret rapture before the tribulation. In summary of early Christian theology, when we step back and look at the evidence, a pattern becomes very clear. For the first 1800 years of Christian history, the dominant expectation was that the church would endure tribulation before the final return of Christ. And this conclusion is widely acknowledged by church historians. Historian Philip Schaff writes in the History of the Christian Church, "The early church believed the Antichrist would appear before the return of Christ." In other words, early Christians expected tribulation before Christ's return, not escape from it. Early church Christians did not believe in some secret escaping from any tribulation. Early church Christians expected to endure any tribulation that comes to them. So we ask, where did modern rapture doctrine come from? Where did modern rapture doctrine come from? The modern formulation of the pre-tribulation rapture began in the early 1800s. The most influential figure in its development was John Nelson Darby. Now, Darby was a leader in the Plymouth Brethren movement in Britain. Darby developed a theological system now called dispensationalism. And dispensationalism introduced several key ideas. First, it divided biblical history into distinct eras called dispensations. Second, it created a strong distinction between Israel and the church as two separate peoples of God with different prophetic destinies. Now, within this framework, Darby concluded that the church must be removed before the tribulation, because the tribulation was part of God's prophetic plan for Israel. Now, the rapture doctrine is largely going to be biased according to how you believe ecclesiology and eschatology, how you view Israel and how you view the rest of the people of God. If you're familiar with the writings of the Apostle Paul, there is no more Jew and there is no more Gentile. But we are all one body in Jesus Christ. All believers are one body. We are all descendants of grace because of Jesus Christ's atonement and our faith in Him. We are all Israel, one body united in Jesus Christ. Now, Darby's ideas spread through prophecy conferences in Britain and America, but their greatest expansion occurred through the publication of the Scofield Reference Bible in 1909. The Scofield Bible placed dispensational interpretation directly in the notes alongside the biblical text. And this is similar to modern study Bibles. You see it a lot in John MacArthur Study Bible, the Reformation Study Bible, the Matthew Henry Study Bible, the ESV Study Bible, where scholars and theologians come together and they write study notes of what this biblical verse would mean. And for the most part, they do a really good job. Well, Nelson Darby did the same thing in the Scofield Reference Bible. The notes that he put in there were biased towards his doctrine of dispensationalism, which we now know as giving way to the modern Rapture Doctrine. So for many readers, those notes appeared almost as authoritative as Scripture itself. This greatly accelerated the spread of the Rapture Doctrine throughout American evangelicalism. Modern historians have acknowledged that the pre-tribulation Rapture Doctrine is a relatively recent development. Historian Ernest R. Sandin, in his book, The Roots of Fundamentalism, British and American Millenarianism, 1800 to 1930, explains how dispensationalism and the Rapture Doctrine developed in the 19th century. New Testament scholar George Eldon Ladd, in his book, The Blessed Hope, states, the pre-tribulation rapture view is a relatively recent doctrine that did not appear in the early church. These observations come not from critics alone, but from respected evangelical scholars. And by the late 20th century, the Rapture Doctrine had become deeply embedded in American evangelical culture. Prophecy conferences, radio programs, books and films. Perhaps the most famous example is the Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. And if you've ever seen any of those films, they're pretty corny. But I mean, if you're biased towards the Rapture Doctrine and dispensationalism, you're gonna root for them regardless of how misconstrued they make doctrine in Scripture look. But if that's your thing, these books sold tens of thousands of copies and shaped how many Christians imagined the end times. But popularity is not the same as biblical authority. Popularity doesn't always necessitate truth, or I should say, popularity doesn't always determine validity. Christian doctrine must always be evaluated by two standards: Scripture itself and the historic witness of the church. So when a doctrine appears nearly 18 centuries after the apostles, it deserves careful examination. The Christian hope is not centered on escaping history. It is centered on Christ ruling over history. It is centered on faith in Jesus Christ, regardless of the circumstances and pre-tribulation around us. Scripture consistently presents Christ's return as a public climactic event. The resurrection of the dead, the judgment of the world, the renewal of creation. These events occur together when the King returns. The hope of the church has always been the visible return of Jesus Christ, not a hidden disappearance of believers. I hope you enjoyed this episode on the Rapture Doctrine, and in the next episode, we will examine the most commonly cited rapture passage in the Bible, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Does this passage actually describe a secret rapture, or does it describe believers going out to meet the returning King? And in the next episode, we'll examine the Greek text itself. Until then, remember, doctrine matters because truth shapes faith and faith shapes eternity. This is DGMA Doctrine Productions. Thank you for your attention. Please subscribe, like, comment, let me know what you liked about this video, what you might like to see, what you didn't like, what you agree with, what you don't like. Be respectful. I love to communicate with you. See you on the next episode.